Good day, everybody. I just wanted to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about Chapter 2, one of the required readings for everyone in Module 1. So let's take a quick look. There we go. Get it nice and large, and then I'll drop it back down again as we get closer. So in any event, we're going to work through Chapter 2 here. I'm going to give you a little bit of some of my ideas. It's a 15-minute video, so I'm going to try to keep it brief as I possibly can, although please understand that each one of these topics could be rendered, you could talk hours on some of these individuals. We're going to do just a glossary kind of overview, and then my expectation is that you are reading the chapter and drawing your own conclusions and your own ideas. All right, so let me drop back down here into the corner, and let me go ahead and get into presentation mode for my PowerPoint. Again, this is Chapter 2, the big picture in your classroom, focusing the instruction in a social kaleidoscope. Orlick, of course, is our author. So if you take a look at the beginning of the chapter, it's divided into a couple different sections. The first section is a holistic view of instruction. And then the second section is 3 perspectives on instructional decision making. That's really where the meat of the chapter, and also the components that really are going to help you answer your first Module 1 discussion board post, as well as your assignment 1. So when we look at a holistic view of instruction, Orlick is kind of making the argument that you're looking at it from a very holistic sense in terms of your teaching. And what that means is that you're shifting instruction constantly from this big picture utopian view of what education is and what you view to be education to be, as well as you're shifting that down to making sure that your students are responsible for the specific parts that they have to master, whether they're to meet the standard course of study, your pacing guide, or even just the instructional objectives for the class that day. So this is really where theory and practice kind of really intersect. And we talk a little bit about theory, and we will here in the chapter, but the assignments that we prepare in this class are really grounded in the practice of teaching. And for some of you, this may be the first time that you are engaged in this type of experience, and that's okay, because there always has to be a first time, especially in teaching, because the first time you do something is always, to me, I think about the first year of my teaching experience, it was probably my worst teaching year. But you have to have that first experience in order to be able to grow, and that's why reflection is so important. So my second and my third and my fourth year get better and better. Some might even argue, or I've argued actually, that, I probably should have been fired after what I did to my students the first year. While that's kind of an exaggeration, it is true that you grow as a teacher based upon your ability to reflect. So let's talk a little bit more. The basis for instructional decision making. Orlick talks about procedural aspects, learning perspectives, and attitudinal aspects. He even gives you a great figure. It's 2.1 on page 23 of the book. And he places learner at the center of all those decision-making in this model. And so that's critically important to understand, because these procedural aspects, we'll talk about some of those in assignment 1, planning, lesson design, classroom dynamics, instructional techniques, your assessment of learning, your implementation. These are all critically important aspects that are covered in 301, but we can never forget about couching each of these in some type of learning perspective, whether it's a developmental learning perspective, a behavioral, or a cognitive, and we'll talk about those in a second. And last but not least, the attitudinal aspects, thinking about education and equitable ways in which we can educate all of our kids, whether students from special needs, low socioeconomic status backgrounds, or even students who are gifted. So we want to think about that, and we do that by providing students, in some cases, with these active learning experience, and they do so in a supportive environment where they feel safe and they feel cared for and they feel supported. And we want to see that in that commitment. So in any event, take a look at that chart. It is important. Now, I am not going to go into great amounts of detail, but I do want to talk about Orlick's 3 perspectives on instructional decision making. He talks about developmental theory, and he gets at a variety of different authors that in ed psychology we'd have a lot more time to really delve into, but He talks a little bit about Piaget and the 4 human stages of development. He talks a lot about how those stages of development overlap. So some students progress into different stages before other students do, and you as a teacher have to make sure that you are providing on a holistic basis, age-appropriate materials and content, but monitoring your students' interactions with those, so that way you can kind of, change out from student to student depending on what types of materials they are responding to. And there's a couple paragraphs here about Piaget and the explanation of the stages. One of my favorite authors is Vygotsky, and this is where he talks about social mediated learning in zones. And these are zones of what he calls, or what he terms, proximal development. So one of the things that's important when you're thinking about Vygotsky is that you really want to make sure that you are pre-assessing. And I'm not talking about a formal assessment. I'm just talking about understanding what your students know. Having some type of a baseline where you can say to yourself, okay, here's what they know, here's what they understand, here's the types of things that I can introduce to help them grow. And then what we see a lot more in Vygotsky is that there's this social interaction, or this student-to-student kind of peer sharing of knowledge, or even, the teacher as the facilitator. So we think a lot about Vygotsky's social mediated learning and these zones of proximal development, and we do so in a way where we're thinking about this social quality or this other aspect that's involved. So one of the things that Orlick also talks about is behavioral theory. And so he alludes to the fact that this is kind of Skinner's work, and then Tyler kind of expounded upon that. But one of the ways in which behavioral theory we see right now is through the standards movement and the accountability movement, because this is definitely an extension of that type of work that was done very early on in the early 1900s to the 1950s. And so it's about a transfer of learning and this application of something learned, and then you apply that application to a new and a novel setting, and understanding that you're able to, kind of stand on the shoulders that are those that have gone before you. And the same thing is with the content. You're standing on the content, and then you're adding to that content as you go. We see a lot of our behavioral theories in direct instruction, and this is when we're providing whole group or teacher-directed instruction. We also see it in programmed instruction, and this is called what we call computer-assisted interventions or education. So I've used direct instruction in my teaching. It's important, at least for the high school setting, but it's also just a part of what I do. So just keep that in mind. Whole group, there is a place for whole group and teacher-directed instruction. At least in my mind there is. Some might argue otherwise. And then the last is this cognitive psychology piece, or metacognition. So it's such a great word. It's thinking about your thinking, or students thinking about their thinking. And so what you're trying to do is get your students to be a little bit more aware of what's happening intellectually, cognitively. And we do that by providing experiences. So experienced or experiential based learning and information processing. These are all components to that type of learning. And I'm following along in my book, trying to keep up. But that we see a lot of that there. So active learning is also a part of cognitive psychology, and so this is like learner activated instruction. And so how do we, as an educator, as a teacher, become more of a facilitator and allowing students to have a little bit more choice in their learning? And we see this student choice as something that has now emerged kind of in the 21st century. We see a lot of student choice learning happening in maybe some more of our private school settings or our charter school settings. It's very experimental. It's self-directed. And there is a lot of onus on that student, what we call ownership. And you can do that in your classroom independent of whether you're teaching in a public or parochial or private or charter school. It's just about trying to make sure that you're building out your class of students, so that way they have some understanding of what's expected of them if they're going to guide their own instruction. Independent study. Now, when I say independent study, this isn't like study hall type of learning. This is more like the teacher as the facilitator. So the teacher is providing the resources and the materials. We see this a lot in science education. We call it inquiry. But what we do is we provide materials and we put them in place for the kids. And then we take a step back as teacher. We're not talking to them. We're more or less just kind of like coaching, monitoring, refereeing what's happening. And we're allowing them to generate that knowledge based upon the materials and resources and instruction we provided. So it's just a very different philosophy from teacher directed, but not altogether disconnected. I think a really good teacher does all of these things. But many of you may find one of these approaches that you may like a little bit more than the other, and that's fine. And virtual learning, and this is where computer games and computer-aided instruction comes in. We see so much more of this now. A good game, a good computer game is one that keeps your attention, that keeps you motivated. And so a good game designer will sit down and say to themselves, okay, so they'll make a level only so hard, and that way you as the learner or the player accomplish that level, but it's challenging. So that level of challenge is what keeps the learner or the gamer motivated. So we see a lot more virtual learning now too. This was a table. I know it's a little fuzzy, but it comes right out of the book. It's table 2.2. And this really does kind of compare and contrast student-initiated instruction with direct instruction. And for instance, think about the classroom that you're going to set up in your first assignment. And this is assignment 1 for module 1. Flexibly arranged furniture would be more of a student-initiated instruction type of place, whereas somewhat fixed arrangement would be someone who's a little bit more direct instruction orientated. Student emphasis on individual or small group work, you're going to see a lot more of that in student-initiated instruction than you will in a direct instruction. Teacher as controller, that's definitely a direct instruction type of mindset, whereas teacher as the facilitator is student-initiated instruction. And you can go through and look at all of those, but my point is that I'm not going to sit here and argue that one is better than the other. I just think that there are times and places for each, but you as a teacher have to find where you fit in this student-initiated versus direct instruction module. Last but not least, we get into constructivism and theory and practice. You may have heard of some of this in your other classes. And again, I'm not going to get into any great detail, but when we think about constructivism, the emphasis is always on what prior experiences our students are bringing to school with them. So what we want what a constructivist teacher wants is they want their student to construct meaning out of, for instance, a problem. Or a situation. And so it's that student's job to use their prior experiences to construct their understanding of how to come to a solution, which means that there's going to be multiple solutions to the problems that you create. And it's very contextual. That is, it's shared learning. And so there is a component to this where students are working with students are working with teachers, students are working with materials, and they're kind of negotiating and managing that learning process on their own. That doesn't mean that you as a teacher walk away, sit at the front and say, okay, go to it. It just means that you're going to be walking around the classroom and you're going to be a little bit more, like I said before, the referee or the director. And so you're kind of just going to be bouncing in and out of small learning environments and giving them a little bit of help or giving them a hint to kind of get them to that conclusion. This is a baker's dozen activities for active learning. I kind of dig this. This is cool because if active learning is something that you want to have in your classroom, you want to be able to know how to set up cooperative learning groups. You want to know what inquiry means. You want to be able to do teacher demonstrations. You want to be able to plan out with students kind of what they're to do that day or that week or that month. Lots of hands-on, minds-on activities, pulling in technology, integrated resources. You're using manipulatives at least every class, small group discussions, student-conducted demonstrations. So you see the focus moving from the teacher to the student. And so that creates what a constructivist would say, or someone who's has an active learning classroom. This really creates meaningful learning for kids. So I'm going to stop here. Before I do that, I do want to call your attention that for the discussion board post for Module 1, as you work towards completing those, just know that Chapter 1 is critical. Chapter 2 is critical to effectively answering the required question. Chapter 2 is critical to crafting a response. And last but not least, Chapter 2 is really important for